Thank you for tuning in for Mental Wealth Reads, the video series in which I read things to you and I explain things to you from a therapeutic standpoint. Today, we're going to start a different book. I've mentioned it before in the Success Through Positive Mental Attitude series. It is entitled Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And just as a preface, in case you didn't read or watch the other videos, it is a book written by a psychologist or psychiatrist, I believe he's a psychologist, who experienced life in the Auschwitz, one of the concentration camps during World War II. And the reason why this book is so monumental because it's not just a diary. It's not just Anne Frank telling you what happened and how horrible it was and miserable it was. It's through the eyes of a therapist or a psychologist, right? And so instead of just, like I said, writing down things that he saw and then just saying, and then it was horrible and then I escaped and everything was great, he took special note to the specific way that the people around him were dealing with that sort of a hardship, that sort of a harsh environment, and the ways that humans in particular assign hope to certain things, even small little things, in order to overcome suffering. And I think this is an appropriate, next book to follow up the Success Through Positive Mental Attitude, because there's a lot of mention there in overcoming adversity, right? But this book, I've read this a dozen times. I even wrote my thesis about it in college, and hopefully soon there will be more articles added to the Suffering the series, which I have on the website. But this book is incredible, right? It's short, it's a small read, but it is definitely full of very, very valuable information and very valuable insight into the mind of a human when they are suffering. And so I'm going to get this started. I don't have much time for this video, and this book is separated into, I believe, 3 parts. Maybe 2 or 3 parts, actually 2 parts, but the first part is this many pages. So I'm just gonna take it probably about 10 pages at a time, and then hopefully we'll get, I'll be able to make sense out of the ways that I have, the ways that I've separated them for you, and I'll do the same as I've done before. Just when we're done each video, I'll be just giving my insights, giving my thoughts about it. And so, without further ado, I gotta get going. The first chapter, the first section, is entitled Experiences in a Concentration Camp. This book does not claim to be an account of facts and events, but of personal experiences. Experiences which millions of prisoners have suffered time and again. It is the inside story of a concentration camp, told by one of its survivors. This tale is not concerned with the great horrors which have already been described often enough, though less often believed, but with the multitude of small torments. In other words, it will try to answer this question: how was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? Most of these events described here did not take place in the large and famous camps, but in the small ones where most of the real extermination took place. This story is not about the suffering and death of great heroes and martyrs, nor is it about the prominent capos, the prisoners who acted as trustees having special privileges, or well-known prisoners. Thus it is not so much concerned with the sufferings of the mighty, but with the sacrifices, the crucifixion, and the deaths of the great army of unknown and unrecorded victims. It was these common prisoners who bore no distinguishing marks on their sleeves, whom the capos really despised. While these ordinary prisoners had little or nothing to eat, the capos were never hungry. In fact, many of the capos fared better in the camp than they had in their entire lives. Often they were harder on the prisoners than were the guards, and beat them more cruelly than the SS men did. These capos, of course, were chosen only from the prisoners whose characters promised to make them suitable for such procedures, and if they did not comply with what was expected of them, they were immediately demoted. They soon became much like the SS men and the camp wardens, and they may be judged on a similar psychological basis. It is easy for the outsider to get the wrong conception of camp life. a conception mingled with sentiment and pity. Little does he know of the hard fight for existence which raged among the prisoners. This was an unrelenting struggle for daily bread and for life itself, for one's own sake, or for that of a good friend. Let us take the case of a transport which was officially announced to transfer a certain number of prisoners to another camp, but it was a fairly safe guess that its final destination would be the gas chambers. A selection of sick or feeble prisoners incapable of work would be sent to one of the big central camps, which were fitted with gas chambers and crematoriums. The selection process was the signal for a free fight among all the prisoners, or of a group against group. All that mattered was that one's own name and that of one's friends were crossed off the list of victims, though everyone knew that for each man saved, another victim had to be found. A definite number of prisoners had to go with each transport. It did not really matter which, since each of them was nothing but a number. On their admission to the camp, at least this was the method in Auschwitz, all of their documents had been taken from them, together with their other possessions. Each prisoner, therefore, had an opportunity to claim a fictitious name or profession, and for various reasons many did this. The authorities were interested only in the captives' numbers. These numbers were often tattooed on their skin, and also had to be sewn to a certain spot on the trousers, jacket, or coat. Any guard who wanted to make a charge against a prisoner just glanced at his number, and how we dreaded such glances. He never asked for his name. To return to the convoy about to depart. There was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only, to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home, and to save his friends. With no hesitation, therefore, he would arrange for another prisoner, another number, to take his place in the transport. As I have already mentioned, the process of selecting capos was a negative one. Only the most brutal of the prisoners were chosen for this job, although there were some happy exceptions. But apart from the selection of capos, which was undertaken by the SS, there was a sort of self-selecting process going on the whole time among all the prisoners. On the average, only these prisoners could keep alive who, after years of trekking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest and otherwise, even brutal force, theft, and betrayal of their friends, in order to save themselves. We who have come back, by the aid of many lucky chances, or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know, the best of us did not return. Many factual accounts about concentration camps are already on record. Here, facts will be significant only as far as they are part of a man's experience. It is the exact nature of these experiences that the following essay will attempt to describe. For those who have been inmates in a camp, it will attempt to explain their experiences in the light of present-day knowledge. And for those who have never been inside, it may help them to comprehend, and above all to understand the experiences of that only too small percentage of prisoners who survived and who now find life very difficult. These former prisoners often say, "We dislike talking about our experiences." No explanations are needed for those who have been inside, and the others will understand neither how we felt then nor how we feel now. To attempt a methodical presentation of the subject is very difficult, as psychology requires a certain scientific detachment. But does a man who makes his observations while he himself is a prisoner possess the necessary detachment? Such detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statements of real value. Only the man inside knows. His judgments may not be objective. His evaluations may be out of proportion. This is inevitable. An attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias, and that is the real difficulty of a book of this kind. At times, it will be necessary to have the courage to tell of very intimate experiences. I had intended to write this book anonymously, using my prison number only, but when the manuscript was completed, I saw that as an anonymous publication it would lose half its value, and that I must have the courage to state my convictions openly. I therefore refrained from deleting any of the passages in spite of an intense dislike of exhibitionism. I shall leave it to others to distill the contents of this book into dry theories. These might become a contribution to the psychology of prison life, which was investigated after the First World War, and which acquainted us with the syndrome of barbed wire sickness. We are indebted to the Second World War for enriching our knowledge of the psychopathology of the masses, if I may quote a variation of the well-known phrase and title of a book by Le Bon. For the war gave us the war of nerves, and it gave us the concentration camp. As this story is about my experiences as an ordinary prisoner, it is important that I mention, not without pride, that I was not employed as a psychiatrist in the camp, or even as a doctor, except for the last few weeks. A few of my colleagues were lucky enough to be employed in poorly heated first aid posts applying bandages made out of scraps of waste paper. But I was number 119104. And most of the time I was digging and laying tracks for railway lines. At one time, my job was to dig a tunnel, without help, for a water main under the road. This feat did not go unrewarded. Just before Christmas 1944, I was presented with a gift of so-called premium coupons. These were issued by the construction firm to which we were practically sold as slaves. The firm paid the camp authorities a fixed price per day per prisoner. The coupons cost the firm 50 pfennigs each, and could be exchanged for 6 cigarettes. Often weeks later, although they sometimes lost their validity. I became a proud owner of a token worth 12 cigarettes. But more important, the cigarettes could be exchanged for 12 soups, and 12 soups were often a very real respite from starvation. The privilege of actually smoking cigarettes was reserved for the capo, who had his assured quota of weekly coupons, or possibly for a prisoner who worked as a foreman in a warehouse or workshop and received a few cigarettes in exchange for doing dangerous jobs. The only exceptions to this were those who had lost the will to live and wanted to enjoy their last days. Thus, when we saw a comrade smoking his own cigarettes, we knew he had given up faith in his strength to carry on, and once lost, the will to live seldom returned. When one examines the vast amount of material which has been amassed as the result of many prisoners' observations and experiences, 3 phases of the inmate's mental reaction to camp life become apparent. The period following his admission, the period when he is well entrenched in camp routine, and the period following his release and liberation. The symptom that characterizes the first phase is shock. Under certain conditions, shock may even precede the prisoner's formal admission to the camp. I shall give as an example the circumstances of my own admission. 1,500 persons had been traveling by train for several days and nights. There were 80 people in each coach. All had to lie on top of their luggage, the few remnants of their personal possessions. The carriages were so full that only the top parts of the windows were free to let in the gray of dawn. Everyone expected the train to head for some munitions factory, in which he would be employed as forced labor. We did not know whether we were still in Silesia or already in Poland. The engine's whistle had an uncanny sound, like a cry for help sent out in commiseration for the unhappy load which it was destined to lead into perdition. Then the train shunted, obviously nearing a main station. Suddenly a cry broke from the ranks of the anxious passengers. "There is a sign, Auschwitz." Everyone's heart missed a beat at that moment. Auschwitz, the very name stood for all that was horrible. Gas stations, crematoriums, massacres. Slowly, almost hesitatingly, the train moved on as if it wanted to spare its passengers the dreadful realization as long as possible. Auschwitz. With the progressive dawn, the outlines of an immense camp became visible. Long stretches of several rows of barbed wire fences, watchtowers, searchlights, and long columns of ragged human figures, gray in the grayness of dawn, trekking along the straight, desolate roads, to what destination we did not know. There were isolated shouts and whistles of command. We didn't know their meaning. My imagination led me to see gallows with people dangling on them. I was horrified. But this was just as well, because step by step we had to become accustomed to a terrible and immense horror. Eventually, we moved into the station. The initial silence was interrupted by shouted commands. We were to hear those rough, shrill tones from then on, over and over again in all the camps. Their sound was almost like the last cry of a victim, and yet there was a difference. It had a rasping hoarseness, as if it came from the throat of a man who had to keep shouting like that, a man who was being murdered again and again. The carriage doors were flung open, and a small detachment of prisoners stormed inside. They wore striped uniforms, their heads were shaved, but they looked well fed. They spoke in every possible European tongue, and all with a certain amount of humor, which sounded grotesque under the circumstances. Like a drowning man clutching a straw, my inborn optimism, which has often controlled my feelings even in the most desperate situations, clung to this thought. These prisoners look quite well. They seem to be in good spirits, and even laugh. Who knows, I might manage to share their favorable position. In psychiatry, there is a certain condition known as delusion of reprieve. The condemned man, immediately before his execution, gets the illusion that he might be reprieved at the very last minute. We too clung to shreds of hope and believed to the last moment that it would not be so bad. Just the sight of the red cheeks and round faces of those prisoners was a great encouragement. Little did we know then that they formed a specially chosen elite, who for years had been the receiving squad for new transports as they rolled into the station day after day. They took charge of the new arrivals and their luggage, including scarce items and smuggled jewelry. Auschwitz must have been a strange spot in this Europe of the last years of the war. There must have been unique treasures of gold and silver, platinum and diamonds, not only in the huge storehouses, but also in the hands of the SS. 1,500 captives were cooped up in a shed built to accommodate probably 200 at the most. We were cold and hungry, and there was not enough room for everyone to squat on the bare ground, let alone to lie down. One 5-ounce piece of bread was our only food in 4 days. Yet I heard the senior prisoners in charge of the shed bargain with one member of the receiving party about a tie pin made of platinum and diamonds. Most of the profits would eventually be traded for liquor or schnapps. I do not remember anymore just how many thousands of marks were needed to purchase the quantity of schnapps required for a gay evening, but I do know that those long-term prisoners needed schnapps. Under such conditions, who could blame them for trying to dope themselves? There was another group of prisoners who got liquor supplied in almost unlimited quantities by the SS. These were the men who were employed in the gas chambers and crematoriums, and knew very well that one day they would be relieved by a new shift of men, and that they would have to leave their enforced role of executioner and become victims themselves. Okay, so I know this wasn't a full first chapter. He definitely goes on to a lot more detail, a lot more nuggets of things. But what I want to say so far in this first little blip of part one is that he's already mentioned a couple of things I think that are really interesting and worth exploring, right? First is he explains the train ride or the transit over to Auschwitz, right? And at this point, the prisoners they're aware that something bad's going on, right? They know they're not in a good situation, but I think he calls it the delusion of reprieve, which is this concept of when the brain is met with this adversity or this moment of suffering or possible suffering, right? It is almost an instinct for the brain and the heart to try to assume the best in the situation, right? Because it's a survival instinct, right? There's something about hope that is particularly fortifying, right? And they actually did studies on hope several like many years ago. I want to say it was probably still within the 1900s, but maybe 50s, 60s. They did this study on kids in an orphanage, right? And they found that the kids who knew that they were going to get placed with a family, or that there was a possibility that they were going to get placed with a family, they became ill a whole lot less often. And those who really didn't have much hope of being placed, they got ill far more often, and so in what they found out of that study, obviously, is that hope and the immune system are very connected, right? The body will continue to fight until the very end if it believes it has hope, and that's something that Frankl will get into more into detail in this book. But for this moment, I wanted to kind of flesh that out a little bit just as a background context. I think he does a pretty good job in the rest of the book not getting, too like psychological jargon, so that anyone picking it up can read it. But there are definitely going to be moments where, it may be hard for people who just don't have, a background in psychology to know what he's talking about, right? So the delusion of reprieve, the belief that no matter what you're going to go through, there is always going to be a light at the end of the tunnel, right? There's always going to be something that's going to make it not so bad, right? And like I said, it's a thing that the brain does. It's a survival instinct. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that in other videos, I just mentioned this, in the video, one of the chapters for Success Through Positive Mental Attitude, there's a mention of learned helplessness, right? And this is where there is a game changer, and we'll probably bring this back around because I'm pretty sure he mentions it in some way. Later on in the book. But the idea of learned helplessness is simply your brain and your body have learned by the conditioning, experiences you've been through, the way you were raised even, to either believe that there is hope or to believe that you have no control over what's going on around you, right? And they did a study with a group of dogs, right? They had them all in these cages, and there was some sort of a mechanism that the dogs could press to leave the cage, right? And they had some of the dogs in cages where whenever they pressed the mechanism, it would open the cage every single time, right? And then they had other dogs that were in a cage that had like more of a pattern. It wasn't every time, but it was reliable. Maybe every third time that they pressed it, they would come out. And then the third set of dogs had like, maybe it happened sometimes, but it was never reliable, right? You couldn't say, oh, it's every fifth time, or every Tuesday or whatever. Like they just learned that whatever happens, it just happens on its own, right? And what they found was behaviorally, obviously the dogs who knew they could get out of the cage, not only did they behave more happily or more lively, more just appearing to have more hope, but they tried to open the door more often, or the most often, right? Because they knew they'd be rewarded, right? They knew they had reasonable hope. These dogs in the center, in the middle, they kind of, adopted a little bit of sadness-ish kind of behavior, right? So having the, they would still appear as though they were, generally happy, playful, whatever. They may not have tried as often, but they still tried often enough, right? They just, they knew if they kept trying, the door would open. So they kept trying. And then these last dogs, who did not have any sort of reliable system at all, they not only stopped or started behaving as if they didn't want to leave the cage, like they'd be laying around, not eating as much, just general behaviors you would expect from someone who had lost hope. But they stopped trying, right? They stopped believing it was worth trying because they believed that there would not be any reward. Anyway, that's an important concept to bring up here too, because like I said, I think Frankl brings it up later, but it applies to this situation too. This idea that how you approach a moment of suffering, if you know it's happening or going to happen, the way that you approach it is going to be very much influenced by what you've learned in the past about suffering, right? Were you raised in a way that that promoted the idea that suffering could be overcome, right? Or were you raised in a family with a belief system that held that suffering was just pointless, meaningless, happens to people at a lottery, and when it happens, you can't control it, right? You can't do anything about it. That's going to affect the way you approach every situation in your life. Not just suffering, but all kinds of situations, right? And I've mentioned it in the other series too, but that also affects mental health. I mean, obviously, as a byproduct of suffering, but also in other ways too, right? If your brain is conditioned to think that, again, like I said, there's no hope in suffering, if and when you do, happen to have or develop some sort of, mental illness, it's going to affect what kind of agency you have in terms of, do you go see a therapist and try and fix this? Do you go start reading books on what you're going through? Do you go to any sort of resource? Do you reach out to somebody? Or do you just, accept that this is who I am, and this is what I'll be dealing with for the rest of my life, and just carry on with that mental illness as if it's who you are, and not something that you can change? That also too is going to come into play. So, right away, like I said, this book, if you're reading this, I guess maybe from with an untrained eye, it just seems like an account, with a few nuggets here and there, but it's actually already pretty chock full of good and interesting things. What was the other thing? I think he also mentioned that, there was an initial response to this was just shock, right? Going from a point at which life was okay, it wasn't great, but things were, generally speaking, they had food, they had housing, they were okay, and then they get plucked up out of their houses and brought to these concentration camps where they have to give up all of their stuff. They have to give all of their jewelry, all of their paperwork, all of their livelihood. Essentially, their entire identities had to be given up. The initial response, being shock, is very, very, it's very natural, right? It's a very human thing because, one, I would imagine that the shock factor came from, first of all, just all of a sudden everything's different, right? The body is still trying to process what is happening. The body is still trying to figure out what should my response be, right? And shock is kind of like, it's kind of like a sort of like purgatory or middle ground for actually feeling something later, right? You get in a car wreck, the first thing you're going to feel is shock, right? Because you weren't expecting it, and now something happened, and it happened so fast that your body is still just trying to figure out, take an inventory or take account of what's happening, right? So that it can figure out how to feel, right? Your thoughts and your behaviors and your emotions are always connected, right? And it's something that I say relatively often in my practice with my clients, is that, what you're feeling is correct, always. Even if you and me get in the same car wreck, we have the same injuries, we have the same prognosis, my reaction and your reaction can be completely different, but we're both correct. And the reason for that is your feelings are never wrong, because your feelings are always going to be based on your thinking, right? It's your thinking that is possibly incorrect or needs adjusted, right? But your feelings will always respond to the thoughts that you have, and your feelings will always be accurate to those thoughts, at least in terms of, a mentally healthy kind of system, right? Now there are situations, again, where your brain can be conditioned based on your experiences to feel differently based on a certain thought, right? And it's something that we can do in therapy too. You can retrain your brain to feel different ways, but it always takes a matter of reframing your thoughts, right? So anyhow, back to our regular programming here. The fact that the first response is shock is very natural, to adversity, to trauma, to suffering, to anything unexpected, even positive things, right? Finding out that you're pregnant after, trying for a long time, like, shock, didn't think it was going to happen, right? Something unexpected, right? You win the lottery, right? Shock, probably at first, because again, who ever actually expects to win the lottery? Not many people, right? Things like that, right? So a point to make here is, if I'm assuming I'm speaking to somebody watching this video who is trying to make sense of their own experiences right now, if you're going through something a loss, a joy or a trauma or whatever, and your feeling is shock, it's probably very, very valid, right? I want to validate that for you because it's normal, right? Like I said, it's the body trying to like create a space for it to figure out what's going on, right? And that's what shock is. It's just kind of like whatever. Now, shock isn't just an emotional reaction; it can be a physical reaction too. So, it's a relatively well-known thing, right? People who are going from one climate to another can go into a full-body shock, right? Based on temperature, right? If you're you leave a boat and it's negative 20 degrees outside, your body can go into shock because it just was not prepared to go from its normal temperature to negative 20 so quickly, right? And that's the thing. That's the point of shock. You can feel that shock both emotionally and physically, and then also mentally too. That's kind of oftentimes where anxiety comes from too, and panic attacks, right? Just some stimulus is happening and your body on all levels is just not sure what to do with it, right? And that, that is something that can be worked and processed through in therapy for sure. And I'll have more on that, I guess, in another segment. But for now, we're going to get back to this. The last thing, I do want to point out, Viktor Frankl is coming into this experience with all kinds of psychological knowledge, right? And I would imagine the majority of prisoners in Auschwitz or the World War II did not have that knowledge coming in, right? So naturally, he has a basis, right? He has a foundation where he's going through these experiences and he's saying, hey, like, this makes sense because of this this concept I already know. The majority of people living do not have a degree in psychology, right? As I said, most people are not psychologists. And so I want to point that out because, again, if you're trying to make sense of something you're going through right now and you're watching this video, I want to validate the fact that you don't know what you need to sometimes to process what you're going through in a healthy way. And so if it just so happens that you are not going through this in a healthy way, please know that's not something that is judge-worthy, right? That's not something that means that you're doing things wrong, right? Because you don't have the basis for it. And that's what we're here for as therapists, just to kind of help you. And hopefully, too, in the course of, watching the videos that I'm making, there's enough psychoeducation in it for you too. So yeah, I think from what I remember, that's all about all that I wanted to talk about in this section. There's I think in the future we're going to talk a little bit more about loneliness and how people deal with that. So far, like I said, I love this book. I've read this a number of times. In the meantime, maybe you want some sort of partial reading material. Like I said, I do have a more personal study of suffering going on, and you can find it on the website. It's in the Mental Wealth blog. It's the Suffering the series. And hopefully, again, like I said, it'll be a good kind of compendium or complementary sort of material for what we're going through with this book. Yeah, in the meantime, take a look at that. And also, please comment, questions, anything. I would love to hear your thoughts about this so far. And then also any books that you might want me to read and parse out, I'm happy to do that too. I would be I would love to just help, give you an idea about a book. Maybe it's something your therapist is recommending to you, or something that you're trying to do a self-study on. Let me know. I will be happy to start a video series on that book too. That being said, I'm gonna let you guys go. And let me know like I said, if there's anything you guys think of that you want to talk about or you want me to talk more about, even in the books that we're reading, but otherwise, you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.